My name is Giorgio Riello, and we are here in Venice at the Warwick Summer School on Global Art, and I'm joined by my colleague Anna Gerritsen from the Department of History, and I would like to ask Anna a few things about her present research project on global Jin, in particular about porcelain. Anna, how did you get interested in the topic of porcelain?
Well, I suppose the person who introduced me to the topic is our colleague Maxine Berg. I mean, she is the one who, within the history department, started working on ceramics and worked on, and still continues to work on, the history of ceramics, the trade in ceramics, the impact of trade in ceramics in Europe. And it's through her connection to that subject that I became interested. But that was in part because the place of production that you mentioned, Gerritsen, which is in northern Jiangxi, which is one of the southern Chinese provinces, is actually very close to a place called Jian, which is what my first book was about. So I had been working for a long time on a place called Jian, which is completely inward-looking and doesn't produce anything other than intellectuals and writings by very famous individuals, but nothing to do with the wider world. And it struck me that it would be very interesting to apply some of the same methodologies related to local history to a place not so very far from Jian, this place Jingdezhen, but that is completely different in nature because it manufactures these ceramics that are traded from this one place. I mean, it's a really small town all over the world. I mean, it really is a global object that is manufactured in one locality in China and then goes on to, to really cross all sorts of cultural boundaries. You can find it in Dutch still lifes, you can find it in the palaces in Istanbul, you can find it along the African coast, you can find it in the Americas. I mean, it is truly extraordinary in its global nature. And I suppose what I became interested in is not so much the ceramics themselves, although they're very attractive and very appealing in their beauty and in their the kind of coolness and smoothness of the object itself, but in what the transformations were that were caused by this global trade in ceramics.
Anna, I suppose the trade that you're describing in porcelain around the globe is mostly a Ming and Qing trade.
Well, by the late Ming, so say from about 1550 onwards and into the Qing, which takes it into the 18th century, it gets a vast volume of trade. You know, they manufacture vast quantities and it's traded in very large quantities. I mean, millions of pieces into Holland and then England and across the rest of the world. But export itself starts much earlier than that. I mean, we have evidence of 9th century wares being exported into Southeast Asia. I mean, most of those we know from archaeological finds. And then in the 11th and 12th century, the coastal provinces produce a lot of wares for export. But when we think of these chine de commande, so objects created in Jingdezhen specifically for the export, in those kind of quantities that you, I think, are referring to, I mean, you're right, that starts... I mean, the enthusiasm for that kind of ceramic starts with about 1602 when the first Dutch auction takes place. The Dutch capture this Portuguese ship full of treasure, which includes ceramics, and they auction it off in Middelburg. And from then on, right through the 17th century, there's an ever-increasing desire to have these ceramics. And the Dutch first in the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the VOC, and then the British trading companies, I mean, they begin to transport vast quantities of this, and that really continues right through the 18th century.
It seems to me that trade is central to your explanation, but you have quoted many times how your project is both local and global at the same time. Can you tell us more about these?
Well, I'm trying to combine wherever possible these two methodologies. I mean, if we think of global history as a methodology that tries to understand the nature of connections and that tries to think about impact and appropriation of ideas across cultural boundaries, then that is the wider context in which this happens. So that is one part of understanding what's going on here. But I think there is another story to tell, which is about what happens locally to this. So what transformations take place within a community, within a locality, when what they manufacture locally becomes a desirable commodity across the globe. So I'm trying to find, wherever I can, sources that tell me something about what people thought about the export of these wares and about the manufacture for markets that local people can have very little understanding of. You know, they are producing different wares for, say, the Middle Eastern market, where they have different demands for very large dishes, for shared eating, with geometrical designs in blue and white, compared to specific wares for, say, families, armorial porcelain that has the crest of a particular family that's ordered this set in Europe, in Holland and in England particularly, but also in North America. And you know, there are other wares specifically produced for the Japanese market, for the tea ceremony in Japan. As that becomes more popular, there are other wares that are considered less desirable and that are almost flogged onto the Southeast Asian market, which has the reputation of being less desirable. So it's producing within one locality wares of a very different nature for what must have been unknown markets. And I'm fascinated by the idea that locally this had some kind of impact, that there was some kind of awareness of Jingdezhen or Jiangxi or southern China or all of the empire, the Chinese empire, in a global connection.
Would be a fair thing to say that then the importance given to the local is also about giving agency to the local compared to a global history that tends to prioritize instead very often the connection to Europe. Europe makes a difference. When something reaches Europe, then it's very often recognized as significant, but you put instead the attention, our attention towards, you direct our attention towards the more local. Can that be used as a way to counteract this problem of global history of a certain Eurocentrism?
Yeah, I mean, it's to do with access to the language and access to the materials produced locally. And for a lot of people who have worked on ceramics so far, you know, art historians, trade historians, who've worked at the transformations in Britain, for example, once this production happens, access to Chinese language materials is very difficult for them. So they work with what's available in English language, and that creates, in and of itself, a kind of bias towards the European trade. And it creates, or it enhances, or underlines this idea that the Europeans were the ones who really invented capitalism and brought that to Asia. I come from a completely different background. You know, I spent all that time learning Chinese, so my initial focus is on Chinese materials. My interest is in the Chinese context. But I'm asking questions that are influenced by my colleagues who work in global history, like yourself and like Maxine Berg and Luca Mola, who ask questions about what the global context is. So I'm asking questions that use Chinese sources in order to enhance that picture of global trade in ceramics.
Can you tell us more about the sources that you are using? Because myself as a European historian and most of scholars who do not read the Chinese language perhaps do not have a clear picture in mind of what the type of sources that you're using might look like, or what typologies of sources.
Well, they're scattered across different genres. So there are different materials produced in accordance with different genre conventions. And probably the most useful one, the most wide-ranging one, are something called local gazetteers. Now, local gazetteers, 地方志 in Chinese, are compendia of materials about a certain locality. And they're semi-official, so every area produced one, and every area's administrator saw it as his duty to produce one that showed off the area to its best advantage. And they would gather information about local scholars, about local temples, about the sites, about the local history, about what was there to be produced, what was manufactured, about the taxes that were raised locally. And then it included usually anthologies of local materials. So they are very rich repositories of materials and usually quite varied, although they're also very skewed towards the government perspective. So Jingdezhen doesn't have its own gazetteer. It does now, much later produced, but the county that surrounds Jingdezhen, of which Jingdezhen was part, is a county called Fuliang. And the Fuliang Xianzhi, the local gazetteer for Fuliang, is a kind of, kind of catch-all for a huge range of materials to do with the ceramics industry. Because it was clear that Fuliang was the place that produced ceramics, and therefore the people who produced these gazetteers, because these were updated regularly, so it would be a new magistrate's role to produce a new edition of the gazetteer, and he would take the old one and then add all sorts of new materials, sometimes create new materials just for the purpose of it. But they have things like the records of the ceramics industry, they have annotations for the use of administrators, so how do you need to check on corruption, what are the fees what are the levies and charges you can raise. It has all sorts of information like that. What it doesn't have, unfortunately, is a huge range of materials that give you access for material culture specialists. So it doesn't have much in the way of a cultural context in which these ceramics were used. For that you have to go to a different genre, which is the connoisseurial literature. So this is produced by connoisseurs who wanted to show off their knowledge and their insight of the market, and it discussed all the different types of wares that were available, and it would assign them a value. They would describe which items were most sought after and what to look for in terms of blemishes or identifying features. And then there's quite a range of poetry references. Now these are, poetry is notoriously difficult to use as historians, but it does give you a sense of how people appreciated ceramics, how they thought about their collections, about treasured pieces, or about living in Jingdezhen. I have some lovely poems about magistrates who get assigned to this place and then complain about all the dust on the roads and the mud being transported on the rivers, and the fact that you can never hear silence because there's so much pounding of clay, and it was in some ways an early industrial site, and that didn't make it particularly popular with the scholars and the refined elites in China who tended to write about natural beauty and about intellectual endeavors.
You mentioned the role of connoisseurs. Was their vision of porcelain, particularly Jingdezhen porcelain, matching those of Europeans, so-called connoisseurs? Were there connoisseurs in Europe at the same time? What was their perception in Europe of the same porcelains that were appreciated in China?
No, it's quite different, because the Chinese appreciated particularly wares that were of a simplicity and of a purity of form and design, which were very difficult to find within Europe. So they were highly sought after within China, and therefore didn't really enter the export stream in the same way. So you do find Europeans who actually have a great deal of knowledge about these, but they would be aristocrats who had individual pairs. Percival David is the prime example of this. A great scholar of ceramics who knew a huge amount about individual wares and appreciated them on the basis of his knowledge of the Chinese connoisseurial literature. And that's a very different appreciation from the customers who ordered large sets of ceramic wares with their armorial designs on it. They too appreciated ceramics, but of a very different kind to the ones appreciated by the Chinese scholars.
I understand that the issues that we have discussed over the last few minutes are part of a project, a research project that you are now doing, and that includes working with a research fellow and a possible exhibition.
Well, yeah, these are all plans that I ambitiously set up for myself. This is an AHRC-funded 2-year project, an early careers grant, which allowed me to bring in somebody to work with me as a research fellow, so that's Dr. Stephen McDowell. And together we've got quite an ambitious program. Not only do I have to do research on this local and global interaction within Jingdezhen, but we have to organise an international conference, which is scheduled for about a year from now. And then we have two knowledge transfer activities. So one of these is an exhibition, a small scale exhibition, and we're just exploring the options. I mean, we haven't settled on anything, but we have communications with various people who are hopefully going to be able to help us with that. We've also contacted a ceramics specialist by the name of Lars Tharp, who is quite a well-known figure in the wider world of ceramics, because he actually appears on the Antiques Roadshow as their ceramics specialist. And he is going to work with us and create a new speech or a talk that he will take on to the wider circuit based on our conference and based on the insights by some of this new scholarship. And then the final part of this is to bring some of the insights of the conference, perhaps the public talk and the exhibition, to take some of that back to Jingdezhen and to establish an exhibition there. Probably not an exhibition of wares, because that would be too ambitious to try and arrange in China, but to bring some of the conference papers as posters to Jingdezhen and to try and establish a connection within China to establish a dialogue with local scholars who are within China very interested in how China fits into a wider world perspective, but haven't really had a chance to develop that approach very much.
We're going now back to Jingdezhen through your project and through knowledge transfer. How different is now Jingdezhen compared to the city that you're describing in a few centuries ago?
Well, I've only had a chance to go once for a fairly short visit, and it's now a rather touristy place. It has huge numbers of tourists who fly in specifically for the purpose of buying ceramics, so that's what it's geared for. It's got a small airfield, it's got a large entrance road into the town with swirly patterns in the side, in the kind of embankment on the side of the road, made with broken pieces of ceramic, saying "Welcome to Jingdezhen," and every lamppost is covered with bits of broken ceramics. They really try to welcome any visitors with an interest in ceramics, and they have still quite a large number of production sites, completely modernized, of course, making large quantities of ordinary ceramics. I mean, what is lost, as far as I know, as far as I understand it, what has been lost is the high quality manufacture. That is something that probably by the middle of the 19th century really had disappeared, when Jingdezhen had lost the edge, really, and European manufacture had completely overtaken the production of fine ceramics, and Jingdezhen couldn't compete. And it rapidly declined and deteriorated as part of 19th century decline in China throughout. But it has been revived, and it has reinvented itself really as a tourist site. It has a few very nice museums, one located in the old imperial kiln, and one or two others by the folk kilns, and showing some of the archaeological remains. And I think it tries its very best to preserve some of its heritage and to pass that on for future generations. But as is the same in many other historical sites in China, there is very little that actually remains in terms of buildings, in terms of precious wares, through various historical events, including the Taiping Uprising and the Boxer Rebellion. Much of that really has disappeared.
Well, I would like to thank you for explaining to us your project.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.